or we'll create big red circles where there weren't before because now there are more people. But maybe we'll have time to get to that. Because now we want to close out these remarks with some comments from Bousso, who has been working on these issues very actively in West Africa. So thank you very much. Will you stand up there? Great. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Many thanks for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be here to give you a few hints about what's going on in West Africa. So my presentation will be on the impact of climate change on costs in West Africa, and I'll try to, first of all, explain to you the plan that I'll follow. I'll first give you a few hints about the context in West Africa before moving to ocean acidification and the consequence on fisheries and the ecosystems, before moving to two study cases, one located on the Senegal estuary and another one in Benin and Cotonou, before moving to the conclusion and the discussion. So we were previously talking about regional planning. I'm also part of the West African Coastal Areas Program that has been set up by the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and the IUCN, and they develop a regional coastal development plan from which I got this called Schéma Directeur de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. And as you may see on the map here, most of West Africa is really sensitive to coastal erosion. So we may have different levels of sensitivity from Mauritania to Benin, and most of them are between moderate and high sensitivity scales, with specific hotspots that are really sensitive to erosion, as you may see in the north of Senegal and also at the border between Benin and Togo. And if we focus on the social demographic side of things, we may see that currently we were, I'd say, approximately 36 million inhabitants in West Africa, and that may increase and reach 80 by 2050. Alongside this, there are a lot of human development that are being done in West Africa, and there is a gas pipeline connecting Benin, Togo, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and there is another one which should start between Senegal and Mauritania, and they aim to bridge them by the end of this decade. Alongside this, there's also another multimodal corridor connecting Praia, so Cape Verde Island, to Senegal, and then they plan to go to Abidjan and connect it to Lagos. Alongside this, we also have 32 protected marine areas called the Réseau des Aires Marines Protégées de l'Afrique de l'Ouest that tries to protect coastal ecosystem and fisheries that represent 400 million per year, and a lot of coastal communities rely on it for their basic incomes. I'll try to give you a first hint on the methodology that I use. I combine GIS to map some of the data, coastal erosion rates, and I also combine it to some wave modeling that I use in addition to the statistics and the field data that I collected during my previous field work. For a start, if we focus on ocean acidification, let's have a look at the surface pH first of all. We can see on the first graph, the graph number A, that for the tropics we have a huge and a dramatic drop. You may see that the surface pH is currently going down, and by the end of this century, that may reach almost 7.7, which means that we will get more acid ocean. And if we compare it to the surface pH, here in the study, they mainly consider the first 50 meters in the water column. You may see that in West Africa, we may experience a drop of minus 0.3 that will have a direct consequence on the rates of oxygen in the water column, which means that it will directly affect the fishes. And as you may see on the left side of the screen, you have two different maps considering two different scenarios. And the first one at the top is considering also a decrease of the greenhouse gases, but we can globally have a regional decrease of the fish biomass in West Africa, while if we consider the second one, which is the highest emission and no policy implemented, or if we have the worst, unfortunately, policy making, we can see that we have a decrease reaching minus 30 and minus 40 in marine fish biomass, which means that most of the coastal communities relying on fisheries will be dramatically impacted. And when it comes to people themselves, let's look at the map here on West Africa. You have small stars here representing erosion hotspots, and we may see that we have different ones all along West African coastline. We have one in Saint Louis in the Senegal estuary, Dakar, which is the capital city. We have other one in Conakry, Monrovia, Abidjan, but also at the border between Togo and Benin. And if we combine it and couple it with the flood exposure, you may see that most of West Africa is really sensitive to flood. And you have in here the land elevation, most of the cost is really low. And if we compare it to the population of the country, as you may see on the socio-economic data on coastal areas, you may see that for the four countries, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Togo, we have 67% of the people living on coastal areas. And if we compare it to the cost of environmental degradation, we may see that flooding is really important for two countries, for instance, and Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire are really impacted by this coastal hazard. Similarly, if we consider erosion, Senegal and Togo have the same sensitivity, and it hugely affects the environment. You have the percentage of the GDP that it may represent, and Senegal is hugely exposed with 7.6, Togo also, as well as Côte d'Ivoire and Benin. If we zoom on the Senegal itself, the Senegal estuary is located at the border between Senegal and Mauritania and has its transboundary system. It also implies another hidden topic, which is geopolitics, the importance of geopolitics in coastal management. And you may see that we have some oil and gas deposits that have been discovered at the border. There's one here that you may see in red, which is called GTA, AwaB.DRAMÉ, that has been discovered by BP and Cosmos, and they should start producing gas by the end of this year. Alongside this, we have a lot of protected areas, just like Ramsar site, so the back of Djoudj, that is located at the border between Senegal and Mauritania. We also have marine protected areas along the estuary itself, which is really important. And the estuary itself has been, I'll say, suffering from human development and human fingerprints. In 2003, to spare Saint-Louis City, which is a World Heritage Site, authorities decided to open a bridge along the Barbary sandspit that is framing the mouth. And since that date, the mouth of the Senegal estuary is moving southward and creating a lot of erosion and damages for population living in Saint-Louis. And this directly affects fishers' communities, but also the way that people are perceiving the risk. They used to live with it, and they don't have the same sensitivity and the same notion of danger. That may also echo through the concept of espace vécu from Fremont or the ontologies of Descola. Depending on the different cultures, we may have different sensitivity to danger and how we may perceive it. Let's move and to try to see how the wave may have an impact. If we focus on the main graph that you see here, you have some changes made using Area 5 interim to model the wave evolution from 1985 to 2020. And we have an increase of the wave height over the recent period, specifically for from 2010 to 2020. And we have between 2 and 3 meters an increase of the wave heights, particularly during the swell season from November to March, with extreme heights reaching 3.5 meters. And we may question the impact of these waves on the species themselves, their spatial distribution, the seasonal distribution, and how they may have an impact on the fish themselves. The waves are impacting, particularly during the swell season, as you may see the image here, which is the fishing center of Saint-Louis that's been literally destroyed by the waves. Nevertheless, authorities are still trying to develop and implement a seawall, but it's still flooded. And on the other side, fisheries are also so important in this area. This is also really similar to what we have in the Gulf of Guinea, in Cotonou. But if we look here in Ghana, in Lomé, Togo, in Cotonou, in Benin, and in Lagos, we may see that we may have the same kind of geomorphology. So lagoons and really low-lying estuaries. If we look at Cotonou itself, you may see on the figure that the shoreline has been eroded over the past years. And despite that, we're still having the same approach. So implementing coastal defense structures. And nevertheless, this is still impacting communities. The sea is still destroying the houses. And this kind of approach, so developing hard structures, create a kind of illusion. So people think they are safe, but they are not. And on the other side, that's really hard to mitigate it and to manage it with a different perception that they have. Another study case is also the Mono estuary located at the border between Togo and Benin. And we have the same issue like in Senegal. So we have a sandspit framing the estuary, but on the contrary, we have population trying to cope with floods, and on this side of West Africa, the longshore drift and the sediment transport is efficient, which means that despite the artificial bridging that they're doing, the sand being brought by the longshore drift is able to just generate a kind of progradation. That's how we say it in geomorphology. So the sand spit is progradating and closing the inlet, which is not a big deal. And on the other side, unfortunately, we still have the same problem with the swell during a specific period, and groins are still a huge topic because they have been implemented at the border between Benin and Togo, which implies another stake, which is geopolitics again in coastal management. And here is the last proposition that I'm trying to develop. So I'm trying to suggest how we can develop an open source platform using AI, artificial intelligence, GIS, to be able to include all the different stakeholders. Here you have the WACA, the West African Coastal Areas I'm part of. We also have the RAMPAO, Réseau des Aires Marines Protégées de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, and the PRCM, Programme Régional pour tout ce qui est littoraux et marins. And then we can try to include them so that they have a regional approach trying to coordinate and to upscale all the policies that are being implemented. We can also involve local authorities and stakeholders. I use the example of the Senegal estuary between Senegal and Mauritania, which can have an impact with decision-making, the fisheries licenses, and try to coordinate with the public and private industry to try to develop on-field monitoring on the national and regional scale. And we should also include academics and researchers like me to be able to develop a strong tool to monitor and model coastal hazards, in addition to skill development and capacity building for coastal communities and fisheries that may also be part of the puzzle at the end of the day, but we should be really careful with ethics and data protection. And at the end, I think, for a conclusion, we should be really careful about what's going on in West Africa and try to include as much as we can the traditional knowledge, because those people can have the same, I'll say, point of view and the same knowledge that we may all have here in the room, but they will base it on culture and the different heritage that it got. So we should find a way to connect both to try to implement local solutions in which we may include EO products or Earth observation and citizen science so that they will be part of the puzzle at the end of the day. Thank you for listening.
Do we have any questions for Awa Bousso? Awa, you mentioned MPAs a couple of times, and you had it even in your GIS. And MPAs are so important because, as we've heard, they provide nature-based services. They can protect cities. They're, of course, important for ecological and biodiversity reasons, but they're also incredibly important to people. MPAs that are near cities have higher value per hectare than MPAs that are far away because people get to benefit from them. In West Africa, how are you seeing these risks that you talk about affecting MPAs specifically?
Just 2 weeks ago, I was working in Saint Louis with the head of the MPA, so Captain DJ Kabou, and the main problem that he has is during this swell season, he had a lot of buoys that he left on the seaside of the estuary, and the waves just pushed them inside the estuary, so he's trying to just keep them and install new sensors on it. On the other side, that's really hard for him to monitor the species that he has inside the PMA, and as there's still a big issue with the fishing licenses between Senegal and Mauritania, most of the coastal communities now are fishing in the MPA. And that's really hard to manage it at some point, in addition to all the different impacts that climate change may have. So that's a complex and interesting question that we can develop further.
Yeah. And since we're on this topic, when we've talked about how cities need to change, Robert and also Tanya, we talked about communities, we talked about infrastructure, there's a lot of maladaptation. One of the things that we see with urban MPAs is that they're surrounded by hard armoring, or cities, or asphalt, and there's no room for nature in the changing world. How do you see that being incorporated into urban planning? Are people taking into account where nature will go?
I think it's a critical issue, but I think the really, I mean, it's about trying to understand these systems in the context of an urban setting. So it's essentially maybe it's a set of questions that haven't really been asked enough, because we tend to study these systems where they're natural and therefore these constraints aren't there. But I think in the real world, you're going to have to look at the interplay between them. And I suppose more broadly with nature-based systems, or nature-based approaches, I think there's the challenge of hybrid approaches where we try and get as much out of nature as we can, but it may not be enough. So maybe sort of broadening it. So I think that's a huge area for research and development and learning by doing.
And I think you can also see this relocation that's happening as an opportunity for nature. When we move people out of the way, and in Los Angeles, there's the Bayona wetlands, which was paved over by Howard Hughes so he could get the spruce spruce off the ground. Well, that's been rewilded and reopened because it's going to be susceptible to sea level rise, but it's right in the middle of Los Angeles, so 15 million people can see when an egret flies up and over the city. I mean, so it's really, I think there are some opportunities with climate change and sea level rise for nature that we really haven't tapped into. We have just enough time for one last question. All the way in the back.
Hello, so Mélodie Trollier, I'm coming from AXA Climate. I'm a climate scientist, and a key message I've taken from the last IPCC is that it's now okay to publicly talk about limit to adaptation. And so we speak a little bit about partial relocation, and my question is, what is the threshold? Is it cost analysis benefits, damages? When can we say, for this location, we cannot adapt anymore? And do you have any advice on how to communicate this information and help cities to go on this path also?
Limits to adaptation, if I may start with an answer. We are distinguishing limits to adaptation first for natural systems, for ecosystems and species, where we talk about hard limits, because they only have a certain scope of plasticity to adapt to future conditions. And you see the limits, those respective limits to adaptation also because they are actually moving. Species are on the move to higher latitudes and also altitudes, and they are in that respect forming new ecosystems. There's species mixing going. Overall, we see that's one reason why we see a decline in biomass in species in the oceans. And then we talk about limits to adaptation also for human society, and usually there it's a matter of resources, not forgetting that hard limits, evolutionary limits are also true for us. We are just one of many species, right? We shouldn't forget that. But the soft limits are resource dependent, and financial resources, technologies and so forth can help to push those limits further. But we are well advised not to overdo this, but rather take those current limits also as points of orientation for mitigation efforts, not to let global warming go on unabated with the respective challenges. So limits to adaptation, there's a lot of research that still needs to be done to quantify them, because they will be important guidelines for future decisions and activities.
Good. Thank you. And I think it's a really important question to also ask for conservation and the protection of nature, because there are some places we've seen with coral reefs, no matter how much energy and time you put into trying to clean that place up or protect it, it's going to be susceptible to climate change. And we really need to be thinking about also what are the limits to our actions when it comes to all the ways we manage these social ecological systems. So we're out of time now. We're at the break. I don't know if you want to say anything, Laura-Lee, to move us into the next section. But I want to thank the panel for their great presentations and comments. And thank you as well.
I mean, wow. Yeah, that's one way to kickstart the day. We've heard such outstanding presentations, so thank you so much for your dedication. And I mean, how well are we prepared? We'll discuss this afternoon as well. And quite frankly, I've been quite astonished at the fact that we have all the tools, and we heard Hans again telling us that we know, and we're talking to decision makers, and there's very uneven political leadership. And what strikes me there is that there are some people out there that do not listen to Hans Otto Potmo, and that's just madness, really. So, you know. But in that regards, we're also here today to, you know, boost this ambition and make sure that policymakers live up to the challenge, really. And I love what you said, Tanya, about biomimicry for governments and management. So what can we learn from nature? And I think that's quite interesting. And it's true that we have innovation, as you mentioned, but we also need to reconnect with the realities on the ground. And it was fascinating to hear more about how it works in West Africa and the connectivity within the different regions, and of course to keep in mind traditional knowledge. So this has been a truly inspiring session. So now a bit of coffee for everyone. That sounds great, right? We'll be back in about 25 minutes, so we can start the next session at 11:10 sharp. So in the meantime, thank you and enjoy. We can go outside. It's beautiful.